The Zion National Park in the state of Utah is a land of extremes. Millions of visitors come here every year to see the park's iconic red cliffs rising above the Virgin River. But far from the paved paths and shuttle routes lie hundreds of square miles of untouched wilderness, places so remote they don't even appear on maps. It's a maze of canyons, sheer rock faces, and rugged plateaus where a compass is often useless and cell service simply doesn't exist. In the summer of 2014, 27-year-old Robert Phillips headed into that wild part of the park. An experienced hiker, he was looking for solitude. He found it, but the world wouldn't learn the price of that solitude until 3 years later, in August 2017. Robert Phillips wasn't some reckless amateur. At 27, he lived in Denver, Colorado, and worked as a programmer. People who knew him described him as methodical, fit, and well-equipped. He wasn't chasing adrenaline or dangerous climbs, he was after the kind of silence you only find far from other people. He often hiked alone. His visit to Zion was part of a 2-week vacation in June 2014. He planned to spend several days in the backcountry, exploring some of the park's lesser-traveled areas. He didn't register an exact route with park staff, something not uncommon among seasoned solo hikers who prefer to keep their plans flexible. The last confirmed sighting of Robert alive was at a gas station in the small town of Virgin, Utah, not far from one of the park entrances. He bought water and snacks. The cashier later recalled a brief conversation. Robert mentioned he was heading into the park but was hoping to find places without crowds. His plan was to explore the area between the Hop Valley Trail and the Colop Terrace Plateau. Rangers knew this region well. Beautiful, but brutal. It's officially discouraged for solo travel. The terrain is a tangled network of canyons, many lined with steep drop-offs. Trails fade out or disappear entirely. There is absolutely no cell signal. It's easy to get lost and almost impossible to be found. Robert Phillips apparently went straight into this region. A week passed. Robert should have checked in with his family. He always did. When no call came, his mother in Denver grew worried. She tried his cell phone, but every call went straight to voicemail. After several days, she reported him missing. The National Park Service launched a search and rescue mission immediately. First, they found his car. It was parked at the northern entrance to the park, right near the route leading into Colop Terrace, confirming their worst fears. Robert was somewhere inside that vast, unforgiving backcountry. The search was massive. Dozens of rangers, volunteers, and K-9 units joined in. Helicopters scanned the canyons from above, looking for flashes of color from clothing or gear. Ground teams followed established trails, then began dropping into side canyons and ravines. But Colop Terrace is enormous. Search teams battled scorching June heat and terrain so technical it required climbing gear just to reach certain areas. They found nothing, no footprints, no scraps of gear, no remains of a campfire. Robert Phillips had vanished without a trace. After several weeks, the active search was suspended. Investigators considered multiple theories, all tragic, but all plausible for that region. The most likely, an accident. He could have fallen from one of the many cliffs, his body ending up in a narrow slot canyon invisible from the ground or the air. Another possibility, wildlife. Zion is home to mountain lions. Attacks are extremely rare, but not impossible. A third, dehydration or heat stroke. A lost hiker without water can deteriorate quickly in that environment. In every scenario, the chance of finding him alive or at all dropped with each passing day. The case was eventually closed. Robert Phillips was officially listed as missing. For his family, 3 years of agonizing uncertainty began, a torment worse than any definitive loss. What they didn't know was that the truth they would eventually learn was far more horrifying than a fall, a wild animal, or the desert heat. For 3 years, the wild backcountry of Zion kept it secret about what happened to Robert Phillips. Then, in August 2017, that secret was uncovered entirely by accident by 2 teenagers. 3 years had passed without a single clue. Robert's family had been living in limbo. Search teams had long since moved on, and his case had become just another line in the National Park Service files. Missing, presumed dead in an accidental fall. At least, that's what everyone believed until that August, when the silence finally broke. 2 teenagers from Utah had decided to go hiking near Colop Canyon. Like Robert 3 years earlier, they were looking for solitude and chose a route that didn't appear on standard trail maps. They entered an area rangers classify as extremely difficult, remote terrain requiring strong navigational skills and solid physical endurance. They followed the floor of a narrow side canyon cluttered with boulders and deadfall. The place was isolated, miles from any official trail. At one point, one of the teens stopped and pointed up the canyon wall. Among the thick juniper trees, something looked out of place. Something that didn't belong there. At first they thought it might be litter left by careless hikers, or maybe some old climbing gear. But the closer they got, the more unsettling the shape became. They scrambled up the slope of loose rock and then froze. What they saw sent them running. Hanging from a thick branch, roughly 15 feet above the ground, was the figure of a human being. They didn't dare get any closer. They climbed back down the canyon as fast as they could and made the long trek until their phones finally picked up a signal. When they reached their car, they immediately called 911. Because of the location, the call was transferred to Zion National Park Rangers and the Washington County Sheriff's Office. The teens were able to send fairly accurate GPS coordinates, a crucial detail. Without them, locating that exact spot in the canyon maze would have been nearly impossible. A team of rangers and detectives reached the site. The descent into the canyon required climbing gear, and approaching the tree safely was a challenge. What they found was far more disturbing than anything the teenagers had described. There were indeed human remains hanging from the tree. After 3 years exposed to the elements, the body was almost fully skeletonized, though remnants of hiking clothes, pants, and a shirt still clung to it. But the most disturbing part wasn't the fact of death itself. It was the staging. The skeleton hadn't simply been hanging there. It had been tied to the tree. Heavy nylon straps, the kind used on backpacks or to secure loads, were wrapped tightly around the torso and the branch. The knots were deliberate, intentional, unmistakably done by hand. The body was placed high enough to be out of reach of scavengers, which may explain why it remained in that position for so long. But the most horrifying discovery was still ahead. The skeleton was missing its head. Further examination at the scene revealed more disturbing details. The bones of both hands had been broken. The medical examiner, called to the site, later concluded these injuries occurred while the victim was still alive or shortly before death. The knee joints had also been shattered, evidence of extreme force. This was no fall. This was no animal attack. This was deliberate violence. Investigators searched the rocky ground beneath the body. Directly under it, they found 2 items. The first was a hiking knife in its sheath. When removed, the blade showed signs of heavy wear or damage, as if someone had tried cutting something extremely hard. Next to it lay an empty canvas sleeve designed to hold a water bottle. The bottle itself was nowhere to be found. Robert Phillips's backpack, which should have contained his food, tent, sleeping bag, and most importantly, his identification, was missing. The missing skull was the biggest obstacle to identifying the remains. But 3 days after the initial discovery, during a wider search of the area, park staff made a second breakthrough. Roughly a mile and a half from the canyon, on a high rock ledge, they came across a large vulture nest. Vultures are nothing unusual in Zion, but what drew the rangers' attention was a scatter of bones at the base of the cliff directly beneath the nest. Birds often drop parts of their scavenged meals. Mixed in with the animal bones, the rangers found what they had been hoping for, the remains of a human skull. The skull was badly damaged, but the upper row of teeth was almost completely intact. All the remains, the skeleton from the canyon and the skull fragments from the cliff, were carefully collected and sent to the Utah State Medical Examiner's office in Salt Lake City. Now the investigation had one urgent priority: identify the victim. Naturally, they revisited the case of Robert Phillips, who had vanished in that same region 3 years earlier. Robert's dental records were requested from his dentist in Denver and immediately forwarded to the forensic experts. A comparison of the preserved teeth with Phillips's X-rays showed a perfect match. To confirm without doubt, a DNA analysis was performed on the bone tissue. The result was unmistakable. The remains hanging from the tree and the skull beneath the vulture nest belonged to Robert Phillips. The mystery of his disappearance was solved. But in its place emerged something far more terrifying. Robert Phillips hadn't fallen from a cliff. He hadn't gotten lost or died of dehydration. Whatever happened to him in that remote canyon had been done by another human being. Now it was up to the medical examiners to reconstruct the final hours of Robert Phillips's life. The identification transformed what had been a missing person case into a full-scale homicide investigation. The forensic team in Salt Lake City now carried the burden of piecing together what occurred 3 years earlier in that isolated canyon. Analyzing skeletal remains is never easy, but the bones and the fragments of clothing still attached to them had a great deal to say. And what they revealed pointed to extreme cruelty. The first step was examining the clothing. The fabric was degraded, but dark stains were visible, confirmed through testing to be blood. The clothes also showed multiple tears and abrasions. According to experts, these were inconsistent with a simple fall. Instead, they suggested a struggle or that the body had been dragged across rough ground. But the most horrifying findings came from the bones themselves. Even without soft tissue, traces of injuries sustained during life remained. Robert Phillips had several broken ribs. The pattern of the fractures indicated they were caused by heavy blows, likely from kicks or a blunt object, not from an accidental fall. There were additional injuries to the abdominal region, suggesting powerful strikes to his internal organs. The finger and knee injuries observed at the scene were confirmed to have occurred while he was still alive and had been deliberately inflicted. The picture that emerged wasn't just murder. It was torture. Yet none of those agonizing injuries were the direct cause of death. The key came from the hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck. It was fractured, a classic indicator of strangulation. Robert Phillips had been strangled to death. This meant the attack was prolonged and controlled. The killer hadn't simply ended his life, he had tortured him first, then murdered him. The body being bound and hung in a tree was clearly a post-mortem act, a grotesque display, or a method of hiding the remains. The fact that Robert's backpack was never found raised further questions. Was it a robbery? Or did the killer take it as a trophy? This discovery prompted investigators to re-examine the park archives. They were no longer dealing with an accident but with a documented homicide carried out with sadistic intent, deep in one of the most remote areas of the park. Detectives began combing through internal databases for cold cases and missing person reports linked to Zion. What investigators uncovered next was deeply unsettling. In 2013, 1 year before Robert Phillips disappeared, and again in 2015, 1 year after his disappearance, 2 other hikers vanished without a trace in the same remote region of the Colop Terraces. Both were men. Both were traveling alone. Neither body was ever found. At the time, their disappearances had been blamed on the harsh terrain. Now, those cases were suddenly back on the table, not as accidents, but as potential homicides. As detectives continued digging through park archives, more troubling reports emerged. Between 2012 and 2015, the Zion National Park Security Office had received a series of complaints from female visitors. The stories were eerily similar. They described a suspicious man dressed in a ranger uniform. He approached women hiking alone or in small groups and offered to guide them along a secret, off-map, or special route away from the main trails. His behavior was described as overly persistent, even predatory, but because he wore a uniform, many initially trusted him. Whenever anyone tried to verify his identity over radio, or asked him to show his badge, he would quickly make an excuse and vanish into the canyons. His identity was never determined. Taken together, the Phillips homicide, the 2 other disappearances, and the reports of the fake ranger, a disturbing pattern began to form. But the investigation stalled until 2018. That's when detectives, re-examining the list of former and current park workers, came across a name. Wayne Clayton. He had volunteered in the park from 2012 to 2016, the exact span during which all the incidents occurred. And in 2016, just months before Phillips's remains were discovered, he had been dismissed for an extremely suspicious offense: falsifying a park ID badge and wearing unauthorized pieces of the ranger uniform. Clayton was immediately brought in for questioning. He lived in a small Utah town not far from the park. Throughout the interrogation, he stayed calm and denied any involvement with Robert Phillips, with the disappearances, and with the impersonator reports. He insisted his dismissal had been a misunderstanding. Investigators obtained a search warrant for his home. Inside, they found no direct evidence, no items belonging to Phillips, no murder weapon, nothing that definitively tied him to the crime. But in his garage, tucked among old camping gear, detectives discovered something that made their blood run cold. A topographic map of the Colop Terrace area. Old. Warn. Covered in handwritten notes. Several spots were marked. Next to one of them were faded GPS coordinates. When investigators entered the coordinates into their system, they realized they might finally be onto something. The coordinates on Wayne Clayton's map matched, with striking accuracy, the location of the remote canyon where Robert Phillips's body had been found hanging in a tree. It was the strongest evidence they had. But it was still circumstantial. Clayton claimed he had explored the area extensively as a volunteer and experienced hiker, and that the notations were simply his personal route markers. There was no way to prove that those coordinates had anything to do with the murder or that Clayton had ever been at the scene. Without DNA, without a confession, without a witness, the case would never survive in court. There simply wasn't enough direct evidence to charge Wayne Clayton with murder. The death of Robert Phillips remains officially unsolved. The final investigation report reads: the most likely scenario is that the victim was attacked, and the scene was staged to resemble an accident. The nature of the injuries and the method of death indicate sadistic intent. The case is classified as homicide, but the perpetrator has not been identified. The mystery of what happened in that canyon in June 2014 endures. And the question remains: was Wayne Clayton the fake ranger who stalked hikers in the wild backcountry, or was the real killer someone still out there?